Welcome to University Drive, your pathway to the transformational work of University of the Bahamas. Our mission is to advance and expand access to higher education, promote academic freedom, drive national development, and build character through teaching, learning, research, scholarship, and service. Our goal is to build a better Bahamas by shaping tomorrow's leaders today, finding solutions to challenges, and forging new opportunities for growth. University Drive, where faculty, staff, students, and alumni travel the road of progress together with you. And now, here's your host. Hello, everyone, and welcome to University Drive. I'm your host, Tamika Lundy. Contact. It's one of the most fundamental activities of human beings. It predates even formal communication. Some would say it's an intrinsic need, really. Contact is motivation. It's fulfilling, comforting, but lately contact could endanger your life. And so we as human beings have had to redefine, reassess, and reimagine contact in a pandemic of the dreaded COVID-19 disease. In this episode, we are looking at the technique which traces contact to help beat COVID-19, and that is a goal we are all in support of. Our guest is Dr. Danny Davis, a researcher at University of the Bahamas. He is also an associate professor of chemistry and assistant vice president of institutional strengthening and accreditation at UB. Dr. Davis, welcome and thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tamika.
Where do you find the time? Because we haven't even mentioned your artistic talents. But again, thank you for being here.
Great.
You have been working with the Ministry of Health and the Pan American Health Organization in this COVID-19 fight. Tell us about that.
Well, I've been supporting them with regard to data analytics, looking at the numbers and trying to help them turn the data that they have into information that will help make the decisions that's for the betterment of the country, really. So I figure at this point, we all have to rally around this common cause, as you say, and that was my contribution to it, and it's still going on today.
So I started out by laying the whole foundation about contact and how human beings are naturally beings that crave contact. And, in this whole environment of COVID-19, we've had to stay physically distant as a way to preserve our very selves. And here it is that you are dealing with contact tracing in terms of training and sharing vital information with people so that they can help us to beat back COVID-19. Why is contact tracing important?
I think with not having a cure for this disease, a treatment mechanism right now, contact tracing is the way to ensure that this doesn't spread. The whole idea is how do we stop the spread of this disease? So definitely knowing that a person who is positive for the virus, and that person knowing that they're positive for the virus is definitely very important, because what it does, it allows them to limit their interactions with someone else, thereby stopping the spread of the virus. It's all about stopping the spread of the virus.
What actually is contact tracing? What do we mean when we say that? What specifically do we mean?
That's interesting. You can take the literal meaning of those two words. We're tracing your contacts. We're looking to see who it is that you've been in contact with. So if I was to test positive and we say, okay, you're positive, who did you come in contact with since you started experiencing symptoms, that sort of thing. So once we can identify the individuals who you've been in contact with, the duration of that contact, and then we could now say, all right, based on that, we can now say this individual is likely to have been infected. And if that person is infected, let's see if we can get that individual to stop contacting other individuals, because through that contact is how the virus is spread. And what we end up doing is we end up stopping the spread of the virus. So who did you have interaction with? What's the degree of that interaction? and what's the duration of that interaction are all factors that play into what happens to that individual who you've been in contact with. So it is a puzzle that has to be assembled, some of it retroactively, and it's very difficult to do, because when you think about someone saying to you, you're positive for the virus and you now have this disease, that plays a little bit of a trick with your mind as well. But through all of that, what we're saying is, put that response on hold for a second and let's see if we can do something that's for the greater good. Let's see if we can figure out who else is potentially infected. And so the contact tracing says, let's trace the individuals you've been in contact with. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yes, it makes sense. So initially I started by characterizing contact tracing as a technique. So to me, it means that it's also a science. And for a science, people need to be thoroughly trained, don't they? I would imagine that that is how the contact tracing effort has come about.
Yes, absolutely. And that has really been the segue into my involvement with the contact tracing as well, because my involvement with the Ministry of Health initially was around data analysis. But being a part of the university and being a teacher for a lot of years, one of the things that I said, let's see, the university is all about transfer of knowledge. So let's now transfer some knowledge as it relates to a skill set that we need in the Bahamas. We need a lot more hands on deck. Now, there are individuals who've been doing this for years in the country from previous outbreaks of various diseases. So this function exists. What's happening right now is the scale of this response totally is beyond what we would have seen at any point in our past. So recognizing that we had to scale up, one of the contributions I think that the university was definitely well suited to do was to increase the number of individuals trained in the art and science of contact tracing. So in response to that, I figured, we could go ahead and invent this wheel or reinvent this wheel and come up with a program. But I had a look around, and Johns Hopkins University out of Baltimore, Maryland, and I think many people have seen them now from they've been in the news quite a bit, in the American news, I should say, particularly with regard to information and responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So they had a contact tracing course that they were using in the US. So I contacted them, letting them know that I wanted to adapt that course to the Bahamian context. Because you have to keep in mind that if you're training individuals and things are out of context, meaning we're talking about what happens if you're on a train or what happens if you're on a subway, none of those things are resident to the Bahamas. So the user or the learner in this instance has to make that transition. And if you're learning a new skill, let's try to make that acquisition of that new knowledge and skill as easy as possible. And the way to do that is to keep it in context. So instead of talking about trains and subways, in the Bahamas, our mass transit mechanism is jitneys and buses. So that's the language we use. So we've turned that course into something that every Bahamian, and by extension, I would say every Caribbean individual can relate to. And in doing so, we find ourselves in a position where we're able to deliver this course to the general public in order to create a larger pool of contact tracers for which the Ministry of Health can call upon.
So before we get into the specifics of the course in terms of the information that it is conveying to those who are taking it, I just have a question to help set further context. Why are we concentrating so much on contact tracing rather than doing what other countries have been doing, which is focusing a whole lot on increasing testing?
Yeah, you introduced this question by mentioning context. And the answer to that is all about context. In the Bahamas, we are very confined in the sense that our islands are small, our populations are small. We don't have to follow what we see happening in large jurisdictions in order to think that we're doing the right thing. Let's do the right thing that's particular to us. And in our instance, it's very easy for us to trace an individual. Now I put that in quotes in terms of easy. Trust me, it's not an easy task, but compared to what you'd be faced with if you were in a city of millions of people like New York, definitely this pales in comparison. So this becomes something that's actually quite attainable within the Bahamas, within a small island nation. So this is the reason why, for me, contact tracing is more important than mass testing. Because mass testing lets you know where the disease is located, but really contact tracing says, wow, in this population, we could actually track this disease to the individuals who we've contacted. And quite frankly, from what we've seen through the press conferences from the Ministry of Health, it's not like we have the resources to do a mass amount of testing. So this, for me, is just so logical and follows perfectly along what we have here, our constraints, our context, and our reality.
You know, in the Bahamas, I don't know if there is a whole lot of appreciation or understanding of the role and how important a contact tracer, a trained, skilled contact tracer is in helping us beat back this disease of COVID-19. I mean, this person is really out there, other than the healthcare professionals who are on the front lines in terms of dealing with the sick and dealing with the ill. The contact tracer is also on the front lines, I would say, if they are operating effectively and if they are trained effectively. Do you agree?
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, those contact tracers, when they're functioning at maximum, what you end up with is less of a load on the health system, because in essence, they're reducing the number of cases. So I wholeheartedly agree with you, Tamika.
I hadn't thought about that. You're quite right there. So let's now switch into the actual course. Who can take this contact tracing course? Can I, as a person who is not in the health arena, take this course? Who can take it?
We're encouraging everyone to take this course, particularly if you're thinking about, I can make a contribution by volunteering to be a contact tracer, then definitely this course is your path to that, for fulfilling that role. But I think this course is also about self-edification. There are individuals out there who just want to know more about it. And in doing this course, they find themselves smarter at the end of the day. And nothing can be wrong with that. I mean, I represent a university, so definitely having people gain knowledge is, hey, it's a big plus for me. But let's talk about who should be taking this course. If you think about the large companies out there, the banks, all those other businesses, I think I would strongly recommend for all of them who are listening today that they should consider having someone or maybe more than one individual from their business enroll in this course, just so that in the event or in the likelihood that they do have a positive case within their work environment, they're able to respond as a first responder and start this process, and that assists the national effort as well. So businesses, I think, should definitely have one or two individuals, managerial level or whomever is actually interested, go ahead and take this course. I've had individuals who are currently doing the course now contact me and say, you know, wow, I didn't realize this sort of thing. I didn't realize about incubation period. I didn't realize the difference between a contact and a case. And so these sort of things also makes it easier for the public to be able to respond to the sort of things that the Ministry of Health has been recommending, because they realize that these recommendations are in keeping with what we should be doing to fight the spread of this virus. So by all means, anyone can take this course, and I encourage everyone to take this course.
So walk us through this contact tracing training. What are individuals learning? I would imagine that they're learning fundamental information about COVID-19, how it spread, what causes it. Walk us through it. What are individuals learning who are taking this course?
Well, the course is set up in 5 modules. In that first module, it's just looking over the basics of COVID-19. It's taking the time to explain to the learner what is the virus versus what is the disease. And so we get that separation. We get some background information on the virus, some background information on the disease. And so that's the first module. In the second module, the course looks at the basics of contact tracing. Contact tracing, of course, I think we said this earlier, is not something that's new to disease prevention. This has been around for a while. And I think what COVID-19 has shown us is it's really just brought it home for everybody. We've heard the stories of, Ebola and all these other outbreaks in other parts of the world. And right now it's on our doorstep. It's in our house, to carry that analogy a little further. So we're looking at the basics of contact tracing, we're looking at the history of contact tracing, and that puts it into context as we move into the third module. So let's recap. First module was basics of contact tracing. The basics of the virus and the disease. The second one is just about contact tracing. And then in the third module, we look into the steps to investigate contacts and the cases. So module 3 really gets into the nuts and bolts of it. Module 4 really addresses the ethics. We're looking at privacy and those sort of things around the contact tracing. What are you responsible for doing as a contact tracer? That those ethical guidelines, we instill those in module 4. And then the final module is about effective communications. Because if you think about it, reaching out to someone to talk to them and to ask them some questions around the contact tracing exercise, then you need to be able to talk to people. And what module 5 does, it highlights some of these skills and techniques for talking to individuals and having a successful interaction over the phone in order to make your contact tracing call a success. So those are the 5 modules. I should add that the modules are broken down into very small segments. Each segment has a small multiple choice assessment after each one. The multiple choice quizzes, you're allowed to take them as many times as you require in order to achieve a passing grade, no problem. When we allow you to take that exam multiple times, what we're doing is we're actually ensuring that you are fully aware of the material in that module before you move on. And there's no penalty for that. This isn't a high pressure course, Tamika. Keep in mind, this is an online course for which the user does it at their own pace. So you can finish this whole course if you sit down and apply yourself in about 3 hours. Most people, of course, have taken a bit longer because some people do an hour after work for a week. Some people do a half hour. Some people do it all Saturday and Sunday and just get it done with. So how you approach this course and how you manage your time through it, it's totally up to you. And that's the joy of this course. Because it's not a face-to-face class or it's not a online course where you have to sign in at a particular time. Whenever you feel like signing in, go ahead, sign in. The system remembers where you were and you continue with your lesson on through. So it's very, very user-friendly, again, because we're saying that we're looking for Joe Public to engage this process. All right.
So it's online, easily accessible. You can take it at your own pace while staying physically distant. You can pick up from where you left off and you can learn at your will. It's the similar kind of learning style that you would have for a MOOC, those massive open online courses online.
Absolutely, yes. And there's one other key ingredient to this course, I think, in the list of attributes that you may want to include, and it's absolutely free.
That is fundamental. That's vital. That's awesome. That's awesome. In adapting the training from Johns Hopkins, were there any kind of particular peculiarities for the Bahamian environment and context that you had to pay attention to in order to make it more adaptive for our culture?
I didn't take anything for granted in the adaptation, to be honest with you. As you can imagine, coming from the Johns Hopkins context, they had some typical violin and string music as introduction music and the outro music for each section. And to me, I wanted it to be a Bahamian John Canoe beat. So we got a drummer to put a few bars of Jean-Claude beat together for our intro and outro, just so that every element of this course, every element of it, required the learner to not have to make any translations. Everything was in the native language and in the native context. So we didn't take anything for granted. We, all of our actors in the script, if you think about that section I mentioned earlier about when we're talking about effective skills for communications, there's some actual portrayals of a conversation call between a contact tracer and a contact. And those portrayals, we reshot those. We're using Bahamian actors, so we could, the person you see during that training looks like your neighbor, looks like the guy who you went to school with. It looks Bahamian.
So are you able to tell us what are the numbers from the contact tracing course? Like, has there been a lot of interest? What have you gotten from the numbers?
I'll tell you, I've been overwhelmed by the response, absolutely overwhelmed by the response. Once the announcement was made by the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health on a Friday, that weekend, we had over 100 people sign up for the course. This is now 2 weeks into the course. We've got 340 plus individuals registered. We've got another 57 completed right now today. To me, that is a phenomenal response. I am so encouraged. At this point now, if I didn't think so before, I'm more than ever convinced that putting this course on was really a good thing, and it was worth the effort that we expended to make it happen, because the response has been excellent, excellent. Now, one thing I should probably put in there, you say we get 300 odd registered, but only 57 have completed. And to me, your listeners may be saying, well, why are you getting excited about 57 out of 340? And the answer is, because this is an online free course, we expect, and the research has shown that really not everybody is going to complete this just because of the makeup. It's too easy to not finish it. And this is not just around contact tracing courses. This is around online courses that are self-paced. It's easy to get distracted by life while you're doing a course like this. So for 57 individuals to see this through already, that is just, as you can tell, I'm excited by the fact that we've got 57 already, for sure. Sure. So I'm encouraged, Tamika, and I'm loving what I'm seeing right now in terms of the response to this course.
So for those 57 pioneers in this contact tracing course who have completed successfully, what's the next step for them? What happens at the point at which it says you've successfully completed, now what?
All right. So once you've completed that final assessment, you're successfully completed. At that point, the system issues a certificate to you. So it'll then say, Tamika Lundy has successfully completed this course in contact tracing. And at that point, you can forward that certificate onto the Ministry of Health and use that now as your, to say you want to participate and volunteer in the contact tracing process. They have a few more screening steps that go on beyond that, but this certificate is what gets you started in that process. Some individuals are only doing this for their own education. So once they're done, they may or may not even print out their certificate, because really for them, the driving force is that they have a better understanding of this worldwide event while it's happening. So for them, it's just fine to go ahead and do that. And I would say that if those business persons who are listening to this, if they do it, they're the individual who's doing it in hopes that they never have to apply it to their work environment, because no one wants to necessarily go there and have to do contact tracing if you don't have to. So there's a couple of pathways past that final assessment, depending on the reason you engage the course. And if you engage it to go there and be a volunteer for the Ministry of Health, then your next step is to send that certificate forward. And if it's only for you to feel smarter, then you're going to feel smarter, certificate or not.
So let me ask you something. Let me clarify something. after you would have taken the course and hopefully passed, what's the practical application of what you have learned? Is it only that you can now become a contact tracer for the Ministry of Health, or can you do some other things?
No, I think at that point you become a contact tracer for your family, for your business, for your friends, because what you're doing is, because you're now educated in the process, you can assist those people around you who may be comfortable talking to you first before they move into getting official help from the Ministry of Health and becoming a part of that contact tracing process. So you're not just bound to just go into the Ministry of Health. No, by no means. I think at that point, wherever your place of employment, you're in a better position to respond.
So what's the impact of the Bahamas not taking seriously tracing of cases and contacts?
First of all, I think we have taken it seriously. There's always room for improvement, but I think we should definitely commend the public and the Ministry of Health for the efforts that's been expended to date. But without any contact tracing efforts, basically, this virus will run amok, because it will just be spreading from one individual to the other, from one to the other. And when you consider that we only have a finite number of hospital beds, we only have a finite number of physicians and nurses, then at some point we overwhelm the system and it's just downhill from there. So we've seen some of the pictures and stories out of some of the American city hotspots, and with the resources that they have available to them, and they're in those situations, I don't think we want to be testing that in the Bahamas with our limited resources in order to respond to this virus and this disease. And effectively, what's happening is the contact tracing process represents a proactive response to curtailing the spread of the outbreak.
Okay, so tell us, how can someone interested in this who wants to take the course, where can they find it? How can they connect with the course?
So we have a nice little easy bit.ly address for individuals. It's bit.ly, bit.ly, and then it's a / contact tracing 242. And the contact tracing 242 is one word, and yes, there's two T's right together for contact and tracing. But once you go to that site, that point you sign in, the system sends you an email, you click the link in the email, and you're registered for the course. And once you register for the course, you keep going through the modules, and it guides you right through. There's no interaction needed with anyone else as you go through the course.
Okay, give us that online link again.
It's bit.ly, bit, period, ly, / contact tracing 242. CONTACT TRACING 242.
All right, thank you very much. This is actually a very good place for us to take our first break. We'll be back after this.
To protect yourself and others from COVID-19, stay home as much as possible and avoid close contact with others. Wear a mask that covers your nose and mouth when you leave home. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds or use alcohol-based hand sanitizer. Practice social distancing. If you must leave home, stay at least 6 feet away from other people and disinfect items you must touch. Limit in-person contact as much as possible. To prevent the spread of COVID-19 if you're sick, avoid public transportation, ride-sharing, or taxis. Stay home if you're sick, except to get medical care. Remember to call ahead first. Separate yourself from other people and pets in your home. Everyone is at risk of getting COVID-19. Older adults and people of any age who have serious underlying medical conditions may be at higher risk for more severe illness. This message is brought to you by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and University of the Bahamas.
Welcome back to University Drive. We have as our guest Dr. Danny Davis, who is the Associate Professor of Chemistry at University of the Bahamas, and he has been partnering with the Ministry of Health and the Pan American Health Organization to launch a contact tracing course. So we're talking about contact tracing and how it is helping us to beat back this whole pandemic of COVID-19. Dr. Davis, we were having a very interesting conversation before our break. We've heard a lot about two terms that I want you to tell us some more about: a case and a contact. What do we mean when we say a case, and what do we mean when we say a contact?
Okay, so a case is effectively someone who's been deemed to be positive for the COVID-19 disease, which means that they've been tested positive for the presence of the virus. So that represents a case, that person who is now having the disease. That's a case. The contact is someone who had an interaction with that particular person who is the case, that person who is positive for the disease. So the contact doesn't necessarily have the disease, but they've just been around someone who has the disease. And keep in mind that anytime a contact contracts the disease and now tests positive for disease, that contact is now deemed a case. Now, one of the things, and for me, that's a bit of jargon. So on a show like this, what I've been trying to do is, rather than use the words case and contact, I've been trying to use the expression when we're talking about someone who has the disease. And that's a lot easier for all the listeners to be able to deal with, rather than having to introduce this term of a case and a contact. But it becomes important as you look at other things to realize that there is a difference between those two words. And appreciating that difference allows you to appreciate whatever else is being communicated to you from other news sources or from wherever else.
And I would imagine that persons who are taking the contact tracing course, they have to learn the distinctions between these terms and how to apply and use them correctly and properly.
Absolutely. In that first section where we were talking about the basics of COVID-19, those are some of the things that we talk about then. We talk about defining what is a case, defining what is a contact, defining what are symptoms. Those sort of things make a difference there, so that throughout the case, the language becomes consistent with the contact tracing. Having said all of that, though, one of the things that the contact tracing course stresses is that when you're talking to an individual who has the virus, i.e. a case, when you're talking to that individual, you try to refrain from using these words like symptoms and case and contact. Put things in straight up English so that everybody can understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. There are some other, I understand there are some other terms that I'd like for you to talk about. Since COVID-19 infections have hit the Bahamas, we've heard a whole lot about a curve. And then we've also heard a lot about a flattening of the curve. Tell us and explain to us, what do we mean when we say a curve? And then what do we mean when we say a flattening of the curve?
Oh, this may be the hardest question of the day. Not so much because it's a difficult question, but I think because it's a question that's going to be a challenge to answer without some visual aids. Normally there'll be a whiteboard, a screen, or something to go along with to help this. But we're gonna try it.
Go for it.
Yes. You're bringing out things in me, Tamika. Let's see if there's actually there. So yeah, let's look at this. So at a given point in time, and for us that would have been back in March, the number of individuals who were positive with COVID-19 in the country was 0. And then we had that first case. And then when that first case, we're going to take this in a simplistic approach now. We say that first case interacted with some individuals, and then so basically another person got the disease. And then that keeps going. So 2 more people get it, and you tell 2 friends, you give it to 2 friends. And eventually you get this increasing number of cases as it just spreads out. And what that does, if you were to now plot that on a graph, you will see this line going up as if it's making a hill, to go up a hill. And then at some point, we take a lot of measures. We wear masks, we do social distance, physical distancing. All these things come into play, and we try to reduce the number of cases. The contact tracing that we're talking about is an example of one of them. So these things come into play so they can reduce the number of cases. So that hill that we were going up, now we find ourselves going down the hill as the number of cases per day or per week is reduced. So we go up the hill, then we come back down the hill. The question is, how high is the hill? If the hill is higher than the number of beds that you have, or the number of patients that your contact tracers can follow up with, or if the hill is higher than the number of physicians who are able to treat the cases, then what you end up with is you end up with this overwhelming of the health system. And ultimately, we're trying to not overwhelm the health system. So you'd say, all right, let's not make this hill so steep then. Let's make this hill a shallow hill so that you're not going up so high. It's just that you're going to be up there for longer. So rather than having 1,000 cases in 1 week, we say, you know something? We'll have 100 cases spread over a longer period of time, because we know that our health system can handle some number of cases. And if that number is 100, if that number is 50, whatever that number is, you want to make sure that on any given period of time, the number of cases you have is actually less than that. Because the minute the cases get more than that, now you have to try to find some way to deal with these extra cases. So by employing these techniques of distancing, mask wearing, contact tracing, what you're effectively trying to do is make that hill look a little lower. So instead of having to deal with a Mount Everest, we're dealing with a Blue Hill. And that means that we're able to handle that within the context of what the capacity exists for our health service. So that for me is my best hand-waving, fully audio approach to this notion of flattening the curve. So instead of going up Everest and coming back the next side, we can go along Blue Hill, drive for a while, and then come back down. So the number of individuals infected really won't change. You know, overall, you'll still say you still end up at 100 cases, or you still end up at 1,000 cases, but instead of having all of them in one day, they're spread over 1 month, and that makes it a bit more manageable. And that equates to what it was been termed a flattening of the curve. So
I think you rose to the challenge. I think you did a very, very good job. So now some follow-ups. In your analysis.
You're such a nice host. Then you have to say, and now some follow-ups.
Of course, that's the natural flow of the conversation. So yeah. In your analysis, because I know you really pay attention to the dashboards and the figures daily. In your analysis of where we are today, where are we with regard to that curve?
We can't just talk about a nationwide we anymore. I think we're at the point now where this disease has evolved within the country such that we have to talk about islands. If you look at your dashboard now, you would see that the number of cases coming in for somewhere like Grand Bahama is it's down on the next side of the curve. It's now reduced. Whereas New Providence, we're still at that point where we're sort of flattening. We're at the flattening point in the curve. So we're up on that hill, but we haven't started coming back down yet. So in terms of interpreting what you see on that dashboard, be careful that that dashboard on any given day represents a snapshot of that day. It doesn't represent a trend, so to speak. It only represents a snapshot of that day. So the reader or the viewer of the dashboard has to sort of consider, well, what did we have? How many cases did we have yesterday? And so what you're forced to do is you're forced to look at the dashboard and also consider what the previous dashboards look like.
The context.
Yes. Because and in order for you to figure out a trend, because on any given day, you say, you know something, we had 10 cases, just for a matter of this discussion. So if on one given day you had 10 cases, but in the 10 days prior, you only had one case, then the 10 cases may want you to have to take a closer look at some things. So the 10 on that one day doesn't really stand on its own. It always stands in relation to the previous days. By the same token, you could have 10 on a given day, but the previous days may have all been 100. And so that you look at that 10 quite differently. So looking at the absolute value on any one day on that dashboard could be misleading. So you always want to look at it in the context of the previous days or the previous weeks. Now, unfortunately, the presentation of the dashboard doesn't allow you to easily do that unless you look back to what the previous dashboards were. Any given dashboard doesn't give you a trend. It gives you a snapshot of right now.
Got it. So how does this whole system of contact tracing interface with the dashboard figures, if it does? And if so, what are the connection points?
I think it's only a loose connection there. And this follows nicely from what we just was talking about with the dashboard. Because the dashboard just represents a count, 5, 10, 1 new case, whatever the number happens to be. So effectively what's happening is the individuals responsible for the dashboard represents a count. We say, okay, we got 5 new cases. These 5 new cases, and remember what I said a case was, an individual who's now tested positive. So those 5 new cases are now moved over to the contact tracing team for them to do the daily follow-up with those individuals. And by the time they're doing that daily follow-up, the dashboard is just going for another update. So if you think about it, they're only loosely connected in the sense that the dashboard is that mechanism that passed them off over onto contact tracing team. And that's about it. Now, this is a simplification, but in essence, that's what it's coming down to.
So what should a person looking at the dashboards over time understand about the first wave and the second wave?
They're like night and day, Tamika. And I don't know if the utility of a comparison of the first and second wave is even anything more than an academic exercise at this point. Reason being, things have changed. Testing protocols have changed. The requirements for hospitalization, all these things change over time as we become better knowledgeable for how to manage this outbreak. So you look at the first wave, we had 104 cases, basically isolated to 3 islands within the Commonwealth. And now if you look at the second wave, some days we get 100 cases in a day. The other thing that's a function between the two of them is the scale. And I think we just hinted that, but the scale is quite different as well. And at one point, if you recall, there was this discussion about backlog cases, and some of the press conferences, there was reference to backlog cases being addressed and that sort of thing. That wasn't an issue in the first wave, because in the first wave, the system was able to handle the 104 cases that we had. But I think what we're seeing in the second wave is the number of cases that we have to deal with really is demanding a completely different response from the authorities in terms of responding to this outbreak. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What else has been the impact of this backlog on what we're seeing on the graphs, for instance?
For the graphs, it's been minimal, because basically the graphs are looking at the date when the specimen was taken. And you have to appreciate that on any given day, the dashboard is letting you know the results that were published on that particular day. So if you had samples in a lab and, I don't know, something happened, you didn't get the sample run. So that means that the samples from yesterday were also combined with the samples for today. Then if you had 5 samples yesterday and you have 5 samples today, but for some reason you are unable to run those 5 samples from yesterday, lo and behold, when you do get to run the 10 samples today, It looks as though you've got 10 results, 10 positives, if that's what it's going to be. But in essence, that's not necessarily true, because some of them were from the previous day. When you look at the dashboard says 10. But when you look at the graphs that are being shared as a result of the press conferences, those graphs are actually showing the number of cases on a particular day when the samples were taken, when the person was swabbed, not when the result came back. So that there is also another difference. Because the scale of things were quite different in wave 1, we see where that wasn't a factor. But in wave 2, it definitely becomes a factor. And so you have to really consider those numbers on a dashboard for the number of new cases in any given day. You have to add a little bit of salt to that, because they may not all have been from the very day, just because of the sheer volume that has to be dealt with. Now, this doesn't mean that every day represents a backlog. That doesn't mean that at all. And this is why the graphs that are shown on the press conferences are so much more important, because they present a holistic view of the situation, as opposed to the snapshot of the dashboards.
Yeah, you know what's clear to me? It is clear to me that collecting the data is extremely important, but man, analyzing that data is vitally important, and then explaining expertly and knowledgeably what the data is showing, they all go hand in hand.
Yes.
To help to help fight against this disease.
Yes, absolutely. And then across the board, when you look at data, people will collect the data, and for the most part, there's more to it than just collecting. That data is only useful when you can transform it into information for which you can use to now provide a decision, to inform a decision. So data is one thing, we're making the information, turn it into useful information is another, and using that information to inform your decisions is ultimately why you should be collecting that data. If you're collecting data that never actually finds its way to informing a decision, then there's really not much point in collecting that data.
What do we mean when we say hotspots? That's another term that's been used. Well, it was used quite a bit back in the past.
Hotspots, I think we sort of borrowed from the American context. If you think about the US and the size of the landmass and the distribution of persons across the landmass, you would see that, yes, you could have a hotspot in this city or that city. Whereas in the Bahamas, and let's take New Providence as an example, on any given interaction between the cashier who works in a food store out east but lives somewhere central, to the person who's shopping in that food store who lives out Carmichael Road but has a family member who lives out west. Basically, I'm trying to describe that we are quite homogeneous in our interactions. So to think about hotspots in the Bahamian context, particularly in the New Providence context, for me, is a bit of a misnomer. If you were to look at some of those plots that are presented that show the hotspots across New Providence, or I shouldn't say hotspots, that show the cases and the contacts across New Providence, what effectively they are, they're population density maps. What you'll find is that the higher level of cases coincide with the higher population density, and rightly so. Why wouldn't it? So you end up with more cases in the more highly populated areas. If you look at a map in New Providence, when they show the cases and the contacts on the map, there's an area in the middle of New Providence, to the west, I should say, in New Providence, that has the lakes and has an airport, population density very low. And you could say to yourself, well, there are no cases there. Maybe I should go there, because you can't run from this thing. And basically, right in that spot is just an airport and some water. And that's why there are no cases there, because no one's there. Whereas if you look in the inner city areas, out east, Carmichael Road, all the areas that are populated, that's where the cases are, because that's where the cases going to be where the people are. So in New Providence, in the Bahamas, this notion of a hotspot to me is a bit of a misnomer and is a carryover from the American context that necessarily doesn't have a practical interpretation in the Bahamas, in my view.
So, Dr. Davis, it's clear that University of the Bahamas has been helping with this COVID-19 response. And of course, that's a part of the mission of the university, to support and drive national development, and a part of that relates to when there are challenges, helping to think through what's the appropriate response to those challenges. Is that a part of the institution meeting its strategic goals and objectives?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you'd find that, my involvement with the Ministry of Health is not the only involvement that the university has with the COVID-19 national response. There are colleagues who are doing some independent research in terms of what's going on with the general public and the education. There's been some publication of that study. There are also colleagues who are helping out in the laboratory and the testing regime. There are individuals who have participated in making PSAs to support the effort. So I think the university has definitely risen to the call to respond to this national need and demonstrated our usefulness and our utility in a growing nation. Absolutely, we did.
So once again, before we wrap up, give us the web link again for that contact tracing course.
It's bit.ly/contact tracing 242. So bit.ly/contact tracing 242.
Dr. Danny Davis, Associate Professor of Chemistry, Assistant Vice President of Institutional Strengthening and Accreditation at University of the Bahamas. Thank you so much for spending time with us, helping us to understand some fundamental things with respect to the COVID-19 disease. And you are extended an invitation to join us again for another episode here on University Drive. Thank you.
Thank you, and look forward to coming back to talk to you, Tamiko.
And with that, we end another episode of University Drive. Remember to stay connected with University of the Bahamas by visiting us at www.ub.edu.bs. Follow us on social media, including Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been our pleasure bringing you another episode of University Drive. University Drive is a production of the Office of University Relations and the Communications and Creative Arts Academic Unit at University of the Bahamas. All rights reserved.